Welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer, Courtney, and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum with you. This is a book club for lovers of the word made flesh, and it's Thursday, May 25th. I'm Lee Bortons. I said Thursday, May 25th, 2023 for the archives. I'm Lee Bortons. This month, we've been exploring classics of American literature. If you missed any of our episodes, you can go to Words Aptly Spoken archives on the book club page of leebortons.com. Tonight, we will discuss the autobiography, Born Again, by Chuck Coleson, who was the special counsel to Richard Nixon, our president. Jennifer is on vacation this week, so I'm joined by Timothy Knotts. Tim, welcome.
Thanks, Lee. It's good to be here.
I'm glad you're here, and I want people to know we have two other book clubs to participate in my book club about nonfiction. Please join me for Unfragmented with my co-host, Kevin Novak. In fact, tonight's book's nonfiction also kind of ties into our discussion at 8 p.m. if you want to join us. And for those of you eager to see more of the unseen, look this fall for the Math Map. We are on vacation from that podcast for this summer, but we're happy to have you go to the YouTube channel and watch any of the discussions we had on the first 15 weeks of lessons for our upcoming Challenge A complex curriculum. Complex is a kind of number, for those that don't know. I guess it kind of sounds bad saying it's a complex curriculum. So let's begin tonight's book discussion, which is not about math. Feel free to turn on your camera and be ready to chat. Tim, I think you're in charge of the discussion tonight.
Yeah, it's good to be here again, Lee. I think a good place to start is to ask, we read a lot of fiction in Challenge 1. Why did you pick this book, which, as you mentioned, is a nonfiction book for Challenge 1?
Yeah, there's a couple reasons. And then for parents who look at it and go, oh, it's a big book. I want you to know that was on purpose. It's the first book that's discussed in semester 2 of Challenge 1. And just like A Passage to India is a big book, and it's the first one discussed in Challenge, or I might have said that wrong. Challenge 1 is Born Again. Challenge 2 is Passage to India. And I chose larger books because they had the Christmas holiday to read them over. We have a lot of books that are really on target at grade level, but I think it doesn't hurt for them once or twice over the course of a year to try something they normally wouldn't. So if you're intimidated by the book, that's intentional. So it might be a good place to learn to skim or do some other skills and how to read through a book. But mostly it was because it was a modern Christian history classic. You can see by the title that's on our screen, over 2 million copies of this book was sold. And there's not a lot of Christian books that begin to sell that many copies, let alone, from the modern era. And so it was just, it's truly a contemporary classic. Colson died in 2012. And so as we move farther and farther from that date, and as we get farther from Watergate, which is a very significant event in our history, I thought it was really important for our students to be aware that there has been a president who resigned over conflict. And there's not been another one. All the other ones have fought in order to stay into office. And something that's kind of an interesting side note is one of the policy, I can't think of the word, one of the policy presenters on national news took his children to the White House the night Nixon resigned and told his kids that he wanted them to know that even though he was a political enemy, that the greatest man on the planet lived in the White House because he was willing to step down from his office rather than see our country be ruined. And that what a testimony to freedom that was in such an ugly situation. So it just, of course, the book is about Chuck Coleson. And his character was ugly also. And the redemption that occurs in a politician's life and what happens to him is really quite interesting. And then, there's just a number of quotes that we can talk about later. I don't want to give away the show, but there's very memorable incidents in the book that I found when I was reading it with our children. We would stop and talk about them. So it was current in the news relatively when I first started Classical Conversations. Now it's been 25 years, and maybe we need to keep our eye open for something new. But I think when we parents see the integrity and the quality of the writing and the story that is told, Like I was trying to think of some of the other recent political historian books or even biographies or autobiographies that are out there. And except for maybe Emily Schlake's book on Coolidge, they're all not very good. And this one is a good one. So I reread it for this evening and I still enjoyed it very, very much. So those are just some of the reasons that we read it. And then the other thing that's great is because he started Prison Fellowship. Just to let our parents know about Prison Fellowship, go online, look at their site. They've expanded what's called the Chuck Coleson Center. That institute offers a lot of resources for parents, for debate and challenge one, for politics in general, as well as they have programs that as an adult you can attend, or your student, or sometimes your college age students can attend. So they're just a good resource for homeschooled families and for classical Christian minded families. So there's just a lot of reasons to read the book.
Yeah, that's I was appreciative of it because Colson doesn't try to whitewash what happened. He sort of tells it from an honest perspective that there was sort of dirty, underhanded tricks that were going on all the time. And it's not one of those tell-all where he's just trying to expose what someone else did wrong, but he's just trying to tell the story as it happened.
Yeah, it was good. And so what's important here, let me read quickly the back page of it so our listeners know more about him. And then Tim, you're a lawyer. We're going to talk, we have some questions for you about just as a lawyer and reading this book. But first, let's introduce Charles. In 1974, Charles Colson pleaded guilty to Watergate-related offenses. And for a lot of people who don't know this, Watergate's just the name of a hotel. That just happens to be where the offenses occurred. And after a tumultuous investigation, served 7 months in prison. In his search for meaning and purpose in the face of the Watergate scandal, Colson penned Born Again. This unforgettable memoir shows a man seeking fulfillment in success and power who found it paradoxically in national disgrace and in prison. In the more than 3 decades since its initial publication, Born Again has revolutionized the way people think about spiritual renewal. This remarkable story of new life continues to influence lives around the world. And like I said, through his Prison Fellowship and the Chuck Coleson Center, lots of politicians, lots of business people, lots of CEOs continue to be ministered by his legacy. So Tim, you're a lawyer. Did that affect the way you read the book?
It does. Yeah, I feel a lot of sympathy for Chuck. I took a class all about Watergate in college, actually, back in the 90s. And I remember thinking sort of what dirty, rotten scoundrels these guys were because of the books that we read and the way the professor approached the teaching of the class. But I think, every lawyer at some point has that conundrum of that sort of the ethical duties that a lawyer has against sometimes a moral duty. A lawyer is ethically bound to provide a zealous defense for their client. They're ethically bound to keep client information secret. And sometimes you come up against a moral problem with that, where your conscience is afflicted because of something that you know or something you've heard or discovered along the way that you might be ethically limited. But I think Chuck's conundrum goes even a little further. He has an even harder problem because he's not just a lawyer. He's also ends up being the defendant. And he discovers that he can't both be a zealous defendant of himself and be a Christ follower and tell people that they need to follow him and trust in the Lord. I find that an even greater problem for him than being a lawyer was, and very sympathetic. That really gets at your heart to see that the Lord put him in this spot where he had to give up something that was very important to him in order to be of service to the Lord.
Yeah. Well, and when we've been using Freytag's pyramid to look at works of fiction, we're going to change it a little bit this week. So you and I talked about Watergate, you talked about him being a lawyer and the conflict he had, but give us a summary of what's the action of the book. What actually happened for those that don't know?
Yeah, so Chuck Colson starts his story from the beginning. In a sense, he goes all the way back to set it up for you and tell you some about his own life and how he got to where he was growing up in Boston, sort of an outsider to the political machine, the social elite there in Boston. And he has an opportunity to go to Harvard, and turns him down because he's got a chip on his shoulder about being, not wanting to be a blue blood, but instead to make his own way in life. And works for some politicians running for office in Boston before getting on with some more major campaigns, and ends up working for the White House and Richard Nixon, leading up to the re-election campaign. And then he becomes one of the main campaign managers for Nixon for his re-election campaign, which is, of course, when several things started to go very wrong for Nixon and Nixon's White House. The break-in of a psychiatrist's office who had been treating someone who was releasing bad things about Nixon into the media, where they were looking to dig up dirt on him to discredit him in the national news media first. And then, of course, the break-in of Democrat headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. And, as details start to come out, Colson is caught up in that investigation. He's clear that he had no foreknowledge of those things, but did hear about them after the fact to some degree. He was never really involved to any legally problematic degree with them. But sort of the news skirts tighter and tighter around Nixon and his insider men, and Colson gets charged with several different crimes. And as I mentioned earlier, he can't square his testimony of being saved, because that happens right at that time as he's going through these struggles. He's introduced to the gospel. He's given a copy of Mere Christianity to read, and he believes, he calls out to the Lord and is saved. And now, as a defendant, word gets out to the press that he's been saved. But they're thinking that it's just a big ploy, a way to get out of being found guilty or be more sympathetic to people. And so Colson decides he can't both defend himself and defend his conversion at the same time. So he sort of actually machines a way to plead guilty to something that he could, in a good conscience, say he did, even though it's only questionably actually a legal offense at all. He ends up going to prison and sharing his faith and encouraging some people in prison, growing these sort of small cell discipleship groups. And eventually, when he's released, he decides really he can't do anything else with his life but go and minister to prisoners. So, on the Freytag pyramids front, Lee, you asked about that. This is a weird one because it's actually almost like an inverse Freytag's pyramid. That he keeps going down. His story keeps getting sort of worse and worse. He loses more and more of what's important to him, both in sort of his personal life and also in his public life. The Lord sort of breaks him down and breaks him down and breaks him down until he really wholly gives up those things to the Lord. And that's when things take a new direction for him. But that takes pretty well into the latter quarter of the book or so before he's at that place where the Lord is redeeming not just Chuck's soul, but really his whole life.
Yeah, the thing I thought was interesting is it did take most of the book for him to actually, even though about halfway through, he started to realize he was a Christian, but he didn't know what it meant. And it took a number of other incidents for him towards the end of the book to say, I truly am a believer and I can give it all up for the Lord. And what I thought he did really well in writing this with this course of action is even though, politics is big and explosive, prison's a big deal, trials are a big deal. It was these little things that all of us experience that made the big turning points one after another. And he didn't tell them in a way that often happens in Christian's book, like they were sappy.
Mm.
They were just stories about being with another man, usually who was a Christian or in the same kind of trouble, and realizing there was just more than the two of them, which makes me think a lot about Sam and Frodo on the way to Mordor, and the two of them together is what made their faith possible.
Yeah, I think some of those prayer meetings that he describes when he gets together with people, sometimes people who were enemies of his, political enemies, long time personal animosity, that is completely overcome by their mutual faith.
Mhm. Yeah, and then the surprise when they first see each other, and then the joy in knowing they're going to see each other again in a Christian context. So it's just there's a lot of bromance going on. It's a modern word. So I got a question about the story in general. I mean, it's basically he gets in trouble because him and some of their cronies are trying to find mud to sling on their opponents. Something I think politicians have done since George Washington. What made this different that they got into so much trouble? Do you know enough about the era to maybe explain that to us?
Well, there was a big rise in presidential power around this time. You saw in the Kennedy White House, and then with Johnson, a lot of executive action that was really starting to sprawl, sort of snowballed after FDR and the New Deal. You got Johnson and his Great Society, and Vietnam was going on, which had really eroded so much of the confidence of the country in the decision making at the top. So people were who historically may have turned a blind eye to sort of the shenanigans of politics were suddenly a lot less willing to do so. So I agree with you. It probably wasn't very different from what had gone on before, maybe only just a half a step different, but the mood of the country was very different at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, and so Nixon's always, most people who pay attention to history know Nixon and Watergate go together. The fact he brought up the Vietnam War and his role in ending it, the 1971 where he got us off the gold standard finally, and the international community's been mad at us ever since. And as a Republican, he's actually the one that introduced the idea and got through legislation the idea of a minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was kind of a mixed bag when it came to conservative or liberal values. He was pretty much a centrist, I guess I would have to say.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, there's also that very famous saying, right? Only Nixon could go to China, right? His international foreign policy was pretty remarkable at its time as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So saying any of those things we just listed to any of the book clubbers, can you think of anything that's comparable that's going on today? These things we've just listed? I'll kind of help you out. Is there a war going on in Ukraine that's controversial? Right? Are we concerned about FedNow and USDC and cyber and cryptocurrency? Are we arguing about universal basic income? And boy, is China a big deal. Right. So this time period was from the 70s. So we've got how many years? 50 years. And it just feels like we're repeating ourselves. So it would really behoove I think our families and our challenge students to know that, to read this book, because it would show them that look, this all happened really recently and we're just back here again. What can we do to prevent that from happening? Hey, anybody have any comments before we go to our ad? Nice to see you, Jennifer. Okay, so let me do our ad and then we'll continue to talk about the book. I'd like to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken Book Club's calendar at leebortons.com with links to the CC book site. So visit and plan to join as many of our book clubs as you can. Next week's book club will be on a really short, easy book, Quick Flip Arithmetic. And so we're going to spend some time going through those games. And if you have a chance, bring some cards. We'll play some of the games next week too. Okay, so since it's one of the first books that Colson ever read was read about being Christian was from Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And we read it in the Classical Conversations Challenge 4 communities. His reading forces him to confront the sin of pride. Tim, how were you influenced by Mere Christianity? I'm guessing you read it.
Yeah, Mere Christianity is a really powerful book. It's and Colson highlights this well, that it's sort of brutally logical. It starts with premises that you can't really refute, and Lewis builds from there to really impress on his readers sort of the unavoidability of Christ, and to show that to put yourself in the position of judging him is pride. That he's the one judging us, not we judging him. And I think that's one of the really great things about Mere Christianity is it's not a theological apologetic for Jesus. It's a philosophical apologetic for Jesus, that whether you accept the scriptures as being 100% true and accurate and indisputable or not, the book will still really be meaningful to anyone who reads it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that most of Lewis's books came from radio broadcasts he did on BBC during World War II and afterwards. And I just can't imagine like MSNBC or Fox or CNN having that kind of articulate defense of morality in the context of Christianity. So a lot of people read that book or heard that book first, actually, and then it was redone into Mere Christianity. Any of the rest of you affected by Mere Christianity you want to share with us?
It's really sad that those recordings from the radio broadcast for Lewis were all destroyed after the war. I think there's only one left.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That is really sad. Because I should have thought about that and been looking for a way to promote them. I didn't.
Thankfully, we have his writings.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, and there you go. Technology. So more primitive technology can survive a more devastating crisis.
What challenge level reads Mere Christianity?
Challenge 4.
Challenge 4. Okay.
In our
We have
theology.
some parents who haven't read it yet, so maybe when their kids get to 4, they'll be challenged to read it along.
Yeah, it's C.S. Lewis made fun of that. No, it was Screw Tape. I'm going to tell you the wrong story. He made fun of one of his books. I'm pretty sure it was Screw Tape, that it was so widely read because it was short. But Mere Christianity isn't that long either. Oh. So I was influenced by Mere Christianity by his ability to take mathematical concepts and use that to explain the Trinity. So like his idea that, you have a face of a cube, but you need all the faces to make a cube. Or the way that he looks at the way ships sail, either individually or are with the water, against the water, or as a group. Like he just uses a lot of analogies in there that are accessible to the common person to help us to see that it's a reasonable faith and it's a great philosophy. Okay, so another idea that Colson holds on to from Lewis is the idea that the immortal individual is more important than the transitory civil government. Let me say that again. Lewis and Colson is just, that's one of those little moments where he knows even more that he wants to be a Christian and follow Christ, when he realizes that the immortal individual is more important than the transitory civil government. So why do you guys think the individual is more important than the collective?
That's a really fraught statement today, right? Where we're we're wrestling a lot with the idea of collectivism versus individualism and the community versus the individual. You know, I think one of the things that really strikes Colson from reading that is that as he deals with individuals, whether it's other people involved in Watergate or people who are his political enemies, maybe the prosecutors or other defendants, he realized that his heart has to be right toward them because their souls are immortal, and so is his, and so their value is much greater individually on that front. And also, I think there's this element that he comes to see that's again a more of a philosophical point, that the way that society treats individuals has everything to do with the quality of the society. If we don't treat individuals in our society as worthwhile and as meaningful and as valuable, all of them, even the least of them, then that has degraded the nature of our society to the point that it's probably not worth having anymore. You know, our culture, our societies is made up of individuals. It doesn't have a being of its own apart from who we all are.
And as a leader in the state, you know, especially federal government, he really thought he was doing important work and that it should be funded and they should have the power and that they were going to do things to help people and they were going to do things no one else could do. You know, make sure that, you know, whether it was the minimum wage or make sure that, you know, that good jurisprudence was going on, you know, a good thing about government. And then when he has that revelation that, oh my gosh, governments go away, nations collapse, an individual lives forever. I think that was like my favorite turning point that he has. And what you said also, made me think about in the book how, you know, it's the least of these is kind of what you're referring to. And the least of these for him was these men that he met in prison and how many of them he met. When you read the book, that should not have been in prison. They really were set up. Corruption got them there. And it almost feels like it's this, you know, kind of whiny liberal book that it could be about, you know, no one should be in prison. And that, of course, is a big deal right now. No bail, you know, $900 worth of stealing in California out of Target before they, you know, prosecute you, all those kind of things. And yet it wasn't that kind of a book because he so valued the lives of these people. And he values jurisprudence. He values the justice system. He went himself because he knew he had been unjust. He went to prison. So it's just a very holistic view of state, sin, justice, injustice, the people that are involved in it, and what in the world can you do to make it so that there's, instead of retribution, there's rehabilitation and there's redemption. So there's just a lot of good things that he brings up.
Sure are.
Okay.
And they're great conversations to have with your kids, you know, because one of the things we hear all the time with our four at home is it's not fair. And we get to have that conversation a lot about what does it mean for something to be fair or unfair, and the fact that there's no promises in life that anything will ever be fair.
Mhm,
And Colson is not always treated fairly.
mhm.
Nor are the people in jail with him. But he also sees by the end that the Lord is dealing rightly with him,
Mhm.
even when it doesn't seem fair.
Yeah, and for those who haven't read the book in a long time or read it coming up in the new school year, his son gets arrested while he's in jail, and he's devastated as a father that his previous pride made it so he would not be where his son needed him to be. Oh. So another thing I enjoyed about the book is like, and I wonder if it's possible anymore. Maybe the clubbers might have something to say about this, but I was able to read this book aloud to my children, and I think it's because they didn't know the people, right? They were youngsters. They were familiar with politics and justice system. It's a really readable book, but I think they were able to listen to bigger books for longer periods of time. I wonder if that's the case, and it would be good to get some feedback on are people able to read Born Again aloud with their children, or can they not hold their attention? Have you been able to read it with your children, Tim? Or
Um, my wife read parts of it aloud with our Challenge One daughter this year. So they were just in this book too this year. And yeah, some of the section, especially the end of the first half of the book where it really gets heavy into Watergate, was a little much for her to really hold on to all of what was going on. but she could get and understand the human elements, right? When when he has those encounters with other people, one-on-one, those are meaningful.
yeah, yeah. So one of the things I think it's a good book for is to teach your young high school student there how to skim, because there are sections that you could easily skip over and then go to the next section, because it really is interwoven with very personal, readable stories. But there's also the politics woven in that may not be so approachable. So what's interesting to me also is on page 381 of the book, the last two pages, basically, it's the index of the proper names of the people that are in this book. And that is one of the things that makes it difficult. I'm going to count real fast. Wow. Uh, 240 characters are mentioned.
But the index didn't have page numbers where you could go back and find them, because I found myself referencing it and saying, no, okay, where did I hear about this person before? Because with all the characters, it was hard to track who was doing what.
Yeah. Thanks for piping in there, Jennifer. So do you have an idea of how to use that index to help your students get more out of Born Again?
I was thinking about it as I read it, because the political part and keeping track of who was doing what, that was the harder part to follow. Like you were saying, Tim, the one-on-one interactions, like there was a lot of meat there, and those were very approachable, like you said, Lee. So I had thought about, as I would read it again, what would I want to do? Would I want to try to keep any sort of a running notes of who was doing what, or grouping names together, these people were in this group together, or something like that, some sort of mapping, or trying to write in the page numbers where I saw them as I went through it again. But that all seems too big. Like that seems kind of overwhelming. Or maybe at least writing down the first page next to each name where they're mentioned. So if I need to remember, like, who is this person, I can go back to their first mention. And then thinking, on what you were saying about reading aloud, because of that, I wonder if it wouldn't be a blessing to our kids to read it aloud with them before they hit Challenge One, so that when they're reading it in Challenge One, it's actually a second go through, and they have a little more, a few more pegs to climb on as they read through it.
Yeah, those are good. And I like the first reference of the name. And that's something like a younger child who's listening can go, they can just be listening and they have no idea what's going on, but they can go, Peter Brennan. I just heard the name Peter Brennan, right? And so let's write that number down in the back. To me, when we when we look at these harder books or the longer books, the less approachable books and classical conversations, and I don't think there's very many, but there's definitely a few of them, and I would put this one in that category. I just think it's a really good place to show them, like I said earlier, how to skim. A lot of people help their children think of a timeline with literature, but I think having this people index is another tool that you can practice with them. So anybody have any other ideas on how to help families get through this book with their kids?
We read it in the car this summer, actually last summer, because I directed Challenge 1 and my oldest was going into Challenge 1. So we wanted to read it kind of in advance. Since I knew it was a longer book, we read it a audiobook in the car. My husband was driving, so I could have the book. And there were many times we paused and I would say, that's a new name. Have we heard that name before yet? You know, who is he? Or what did he do? Do we know yet? So that was helpful. That it took like 6.5, well, no, actually it was probably 16 hours, to read it. And it was a long drive. So that worked out. But we were able to just stop and discuss as we went along.
So were you able to bring up things like when Colson renewed his friendship, began a friendship with Arthur Burns because he was so surprised to see him at a Christian prayer breakfast when he was a Jewish man. And Colson just, he just says he's Jewish. What's he doing here? Like, to me, that would be a discussion to have with your younger children, that just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you can't be a church or Christian. So each of the characters, I had like another name for him. And I think the fact that Chuck Coleson was known as Nixon's Hatchet Man, and people called him the Hatchet Man. If you look through here, a lot of these folks that are in the story repeatedly have nicknames. So that's something else you could write down, instead of the page number.
Yeah, that'd be a fun discussion point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Lee, I think I've done with other books. This book I didn't have to because I've had some background in Watergate, so I am familiar with the cast of characters to some degree. But in other books, like say the Iliad, or a lot of Russian literature where you have multiple names for the same character, putting them into groups like Jennifer was suggesting can be really helpful. In a book like this, you could have a group that's like the prosecutors, and you can have a group that's fellow prisoners, and you can have a group that's Nixon's inside men. And sometimes keeping them together that way can actually provide like almost a geographic memory of who these people are because you've put them close together.
Yeah, I think what you just described would be a really good 5-minute introduction to the book. Week 14, because week 15 is your blue book. Week 14, when you're as a tutor telling them you're going to be over Christmas reading this much bigger book, that would be an exercise we could give them to do to just begin the discussion. Smart.
That's a great idea. I never would have thought to do something like that. And what was interesting to me when I read this book the first time several years ago, and I didn't quite finish it, was recalling the details as an adult from when I was a child, because I was just old enough to have an awareness of what was going on in my country. I think I was 11 years old. And the one person that I knew about the most was John Dean. And for some reason, I didn't know Chuck Coleson. That was not in my memory bank from before. And even when my kids were reading through it, it just never dawned on me to sort of put these characters together in the groups like you just described, Tim. That's why I like coming on these calls with you all, because you give me such great ideas. Now, we've gone through it, and I don't have any other kids coming up again to do Challenge 1, but it'll help me for when we're in 2, 3, 4 to think of these kinds of things. And even when I was in AP history, I wrote a book about Watergate, and I found my my paper, and I've yet to sit down and read it because I'm afraid I'm going to be too embarrassed at my youngness, 14, 15 years old. I think I was 15 at the time when I wrote it. But I remember getting a really good grade on it, and I still have my teacher's notes and everything in it. So, and I've wanted to read it to my kids too, but just haven't had that chance. But I found it interesting. One of the other points that I found interesting in reading this book again is just how much trust Colson put in Nixon. And the whole time when he's talking about these events, I'm thinking, I cannot believe you're trusting him. I cannot believe you're trusting him. But maybe that's because I know a little bit more than he did living it at the time. But I think it was a real eye opener when he discovered that Nixon had been recording every conversation that was in his office. And, just seeing the things, it was like you could just see Nixon falling farther and farther down from this pedestal that he had put him on.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I was 12 also when that all happened. We're the same age. And I remember I had a yellow t-shirt that said, "Don't bug me, Watergate" on it. And for whatever reason, some kid at school that day decided that that was a reason to harass me. And all night long, we got these crank calls where they would say, "Don't bug me, Watergate." So maybe that's really why I chose the book, and I've always remembered this story.
Oh, that's so hilarious. I remember being in VBS that week, and that was like the whole thing. Is he going to resign? Is he getting impeached? Is he going to resign? And then coming home and the TV being on, and all of us standing there watching him with his resignation speech, and it just everybody going, wow, not realizing that could, and not imagining that something like that could happen. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, Michelle. Your observation about how much Colson was putting his trust in Nixon reminds me of Psalm 146, right, where the psalmist says, "Put not your trust in princes, in moral man who cannot save." And even how much after everything sort of fell out, that Colson still found his heart drawn back to try to trust in Nixon. Every time Nixon would call, or every time he got a note from Nixon, he'd think, "Oh, this is it. I'm getting pardoned. Oh, this is it. I'm right. He's in my corner." But in the end, there was nothing there, right? Nixon didn't do anything for this man who had faithfully served him. And the Lord had to break him of that, right? And turn him slowly, piece by piece, over to trusting the Lord instead of trusting in men. Even all the way to the book where he gets back to that Baltimore prison and starts a new letter writing campaign for clemency, and has to be reminded yet again by somebody that he's there with that, no, this isn't the way. You need to trust in the Lord.
Yeah, because I mean, just think about if Nixon had given clemency before Nixon resigned to all those guys, we wouldn't have prison fellowship in the Chuck Coleson Center and these 23 books this godly man has written.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And you can see that him coming to that realization while he's in prison, that all of this, there is a purpose. I just need to stay with it. I know that God has put me here for his purpose. And once again, I'm like within 20 pages of the end of the book. That's how I came on late, because I'm like rushing through it, trying to go.
Well, thanks for the effort.
I'll finish it up here tonight.
Good. Well, talking about finishing, we're out of time, and Jennifer or Tim, I don't know which one of you, came up with a great quote to end this with. What motivated me to write was that my disgrace was not the end of the story, or even the main part of the story, The real story was that Christ had reached down to me, even in my disgrace and shame, and revealed himself as the one who forgives and makes new. Born Again is the story of a broken man transformed by the love and power of Jesus Christ, who continues to just transform us every passing day. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tim. And we'll see you next week when we do some math.
Thanks, Lee.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.